Here we are, AP Biology, Chapter 27. We're focused on the reproductive system. This is our third of 4 videos for this chapter. We have previously talked about what is the reproductive system, what are the reproductive structures, both male and female anatomy, and now we are going to get into a discussion of the hormonal control of the reproductive system and the establishment of the menstruation cycle. So, when we talk about the hormones that are controlling or part of the reproductive system, they're operating on a negative feedback system as a way of maintaining that kind of homeostatic level. So we're relying on communication from the hypothalamus down to the posterior pituitary gland and then the anterior pituitary, both of which are releasing 2 hormones that are critical to the kind of gonad production, which is follicle-stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone. Both of those then go down into the gonads, and then they themselves cause sex hormones to be released, which then go back and do negative feedback to control the production of the other hormones. Now, when we're looking at the formation of sperm and the ova or eggs, it requires meiosis, so that the cell division that goes through 2 divisions takes 1 cell and makes it go from diploid to haploid. This is meiosis 1 and meiosis 2. In general, when we're making a sperm cell, it takes about 65 to 75 days to go through both stages of meiosis to form a sperm, or the process that we call spermatogenesis. When we look at spermatogenesis, or when we talk about spermatocytes, the cells that go through are used to make sperm, we can actually look at the process of meiosis. So here we can see we have a diploid cell. It's still diploid. It undergoes meiosis 1 to become 2 haploid cells. They then go through meiosis 2 to become 4 haploid cells. Those 4 haploid cells then go through differentiation to become fully developed haploid sperm cells that then are delivered to an egg through sexual reproduction. Whereas in the production of eggs for a female, what we have is we have a process that actually begins before the female is born. So when females are born, they have primary oocytes. So all of their pre-eggs, if you will, the oocytes, are present. What happens is they kind of hang out in that stage until there's some point later on in development that causes them to go through the meiosis divisions to become haploid. And when a cell goes from being 1 diploid to 2 haploid cells through the first division of meiosis, one of those cells becomes this small, non-developed or focused, what we call polar body. The body doesn't use the polar body, it's just kind of the leftover, and it devotes all of its time and energy on the 1 haploid cell that we call the secondary oocyte. What happens is the secondary oocyte is what goes through all of the process that then becomes the fertilized egg, if you will, which then leads to the development of an entire embryo. When we look at the development of the ova or the egg, it's actually a process that is made up of a series of different steps. And so if we look at the start here with our primary oocyte, and we get to where it is growing. The primary oocyte is found within something called a follicle, and this is inside of the ovaries. The follicle will grow and develop. Once it's a mature follicle, then that's where we have the production of that secondary oocyte. So if we go back, here's our secondary oocyte. This cell only happens inside the development of a mature follicle. It's that secondary oocyte that is released and then allowed to go through the fallopian tubes to a woman's uterus, where eventually it will come in contact with a sperm and develop into an embryo. So how does this happen? Well, it turns out that the ovarian cycle, so the cycle of hormones that happens inside of the female ovaries, occurs about every 28 days. So where spermatogenesis for a male is roughly 65 to 75 days, for a female, this cycle is about every 28 days. And so the menstrual cycle, or the period, as most people know it, is what happens as a result of within those 28 days. And so we'll look at that in more detail. So if we're going to look at kind of an overview of the menstrual cycle and the things that are happening in those 28 days, what we're going to find is that the part that most people are familiar with is the period, which is called menstruation. What happens then is the breakdown of the endometrial lining. So the lining that develops inside of a uterus in preparation for implantation from an embryo. And what happens is when it breaks down, the body gets rid of it because it didn't need it. And that kind of bleeding, as people think of it, happens usually for 3 to 5 days. After the menstruation is done, so after that endometrial lining is broken down and released from the body, what happens is that it begins to regrow in preparation for implantation once again. In order for this kind of ovarian or menstruation cycle to occur, we have 5 hormones that play a role. Follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, and both of those are coming from the brain. Then we have estrogen, and we have progesterone. And these are actually from within the ovary itself. What happens is we have the follicle-stimulating and luteinizing hormones, and what they do is they stimulate the follicle to grow and develop. And that is causing the development of our ova, our egg, as well. Then what we have is we have estrogen. And now estrogen plays a role in actually promoting or developing the endometrium. So estrogen plays a role in preparing for implantation of an egg, or fertilized egg and embryo. When estrogen levels are low, then what happens is we get the shedding of the endometrium. And then estrogen and progesterone together, what happens is they help to maintain the endometrial lining, or the lining that's preparing for the implantation. So let's look at this in kind of more levels. So approximately every 28 days, what happens is the hypothalamus in the brain tells the anterior pituitary to release follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormones. These 2 hormones travel through the circulatory system, and they go into the ovaries of a female. What they do is they trigger the follicle to grow. And as the follicle grows and develops, what happens is that follicle releases the hormone estrogen inside of the ovary. That estrogen, what ultimately does is it causes this huge burst to happen in follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. That leads to ovulation, which is the release of the egg from the follicle or the ovary down through the fallopian tube or the oviduct, where eventually we'll look for a sperm. So what happens after ovulation is the follicle turns into something called a corpus luteum, because it no longer has an egg inside of it. What the corpus luteum does is it's going to secrete more estrogen and progesterone, which go back and tell the brain, hey, let's shut down the production of follicle-stimulating and luteinizing hormone because we've already released the follicle. We've already developed the egg. And then as the follicle-stimulating hormones and luteinizing hormones level drop because the brain was shut down, then what happens is the levels get too low, the hypothalamus notices that, and once again it starts secreting or telling the pituitary to start making more follicle-stimulating hormone and more luteinizing hormone, and the process starts all over again. So let's look at this in kind of more detail. So the menstruation itself, the menstrual cycle itself is controlled by the estrogen and progesterone, whereas the fertilization of an egg actually controls the hormones that are being released. So there's a hormone that comes from an embryo, so a fertilized egg and sperm when they meet together, that actually says, hey, uterine lining, endometrium, we need you, hang out here, and we don't want to break down or go away, and that way we can start to develop the placenta that will then nurture the baby that is developing. If there is no hormone that's released from the embryo, then the endometrial lining or uterine lining is released from the uterus, and you get the bleeding or menstruation period. So here is a detailed diagram of what's happening hormonally to control the menstruation cycle. So we can see here that the hypothalamus tells the pituitary to release follicle-stimulating and luteinizing hormones. So here's the hormones in the blood. Their levels start to go. The follicle-stimulating hormone is actually telling the uterine follicles to start to develop. As they start to develop, they release estrogen. So now estrogen levels are on the rise. What happens is as the estrogen levels are on the rise, we're going to be going back and we're going to cause that burst to happen in luteinizing and follicle stimulating hormone. When those two hormone levels peak, we release the egg or have ovulation occur. When that happens, the estrogen levels start to decline, which then cause the endometrial lining to be released from the body. And we have the increase in progesterone, which then go back and tell the hypothalamus, hey, stop producing follicle stimulating and luteinizing hormones. So now their levels drop. And once their levels drop low enough, the hypothalamus then recognizes that and starts producing more follicle stimulating hormone and more luteinizing hormone, triggering the 28-day cycle to continue. Now, the idea behind the menstruation cycle is that fertilization will occur, that a sperm will find the egg that has been released in ovulation. Well, in order for that to happen, there has to be sex. Now, sex has to occur between male reproductive structures and female reproductive structures. And in order for it to correctly occur, there actually is 4 phases that happen. So one is excitement. So this is usually like the foreplay area where people or the organs start to prepare themselves for sex. Lubrication occurs. And then there's this plateau phase that happens where the body is physically gearing itself up for physical activity. So there's going to be more breathing because you're trying to take in more oxygen to deliver it to your muscles because they're going to engage in a heart rate or they're going to engage in an activity that will raise their heart rate. And again, the heart rate's trying to pump more blood to again prepare those muscles. Then what happens is an orgasm. And an orgasm is simply the rhythmic muscle contractions inside the reproductive structures. That triggers hormone release of dopamine in the brain. And then there's the resolution phase during sex in which everything just goes back to its homeostatic levels. Now, one of the big things about sex is that sex actually can lead to the transmission or the spreading of diseases, and those are your STIs, or sexually transmitted infections. There's lots of them. There's chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis. Those are the ones to catch if you're going to catch an STI, and that's because they can be treated with antibiotics, whereas the ones that are not so fun are things like herpes, genital warts, or HIV, because they cannot be treated or eliminated through antibiotics. They're with you forever. One of the things about the idea of sexual reproduction is that a sperm and an egg are going to get together. Now, in order to have sex without the idea of sperm and egg meeting, you can use contraceptives, and those are birth control methods that can then prevent pregnancy. So there's ideas like the pill or vasectomies. You can get your tubes tied. There's condoms, there's diaphragms, there's spermicides. All of those are ways of preventing a sperm and an egg from meeting each other. That's our end of chapter or video 3.